actually operating the camera, there's really only 10 things that I change and move around on a regular basis. And that is the 10 that you see on screen right now. And so let me talk about how I would set my camera up for different types of scenarios. The first one being just a super simple. In fact, I personally would hardly ever use the camera quite like this, but if I was going to hand the camera to somebody else, I would throw the camera in the program mode, which means I don't have to worry about shutter speeds and apertures. I would put it in auto ISO. I rarely ever do that, but you could just throw it into auto ISO so the camera will figure that out for you. Make sure your exposure compensation is at 0. That way your pictures are not overly bright or dark, but you may want to change your exposure compensation according to the photographs that you are shooting. I would leave the camera in evaluative metering. It's very valuable, and in fact, as we go through these, you'll see that I really don't change that. The same with white balance. I'm shooting raw images, as I hope many of you are as well. And so if you do that, you don't need to worry too much about auto white balance. I would leave it in auto and adjust it as necessary. For basic picture taking, one shot allows me to focus on a subject, lock on it, readjust framing for better composition. The single point is nice, but for real simplicity, you might just let all points, just because it quickly goes out there and grabs everything very simply. And then for the drive mode, just taking one picture at a time is a nice, careful way of shooting. And so that's the super simple mode, but that's not probably what most of you are going to be doing. So some of you might want to set your camera up in an old school retro mode. And one option here would be set your camera in full manual. You might set a shutter speed of 125th of a second. That's going to stop human motion pretty well. And maybe you go with the old traditional f8 and be there philosophy. And so shutter speeds and apertures are actually going to vary according to light. Maybe you want to shoot with a little bit higher speed ISO to allow you to get a little bit faster shutter speed. Good old Tri-X shooters shot 400. We don't shoot with exposure compensation when we are in manual, so you won't see that come up as an option. With metering, older cameras used center-weighted metering. White balance, I'm going to leave that on auto, keep things nice and simple. Focusing mode, if you want to put your camera in manual focusing, you will actually flip the switch on the lens to manual. For focusing points, we don't need those because we're in manual focus. And for the drive shooting, you might want to be in continuous so that you're ready for any sort of action. All right, let's do some real photography here, some landscape photography. So if you want to take landscape type pictures where you have a lot in focus in front of you, depth of field is very important. Focusing is pretty critical in this. How would I set my camera up for landscape? I tend to like to use manual. That way I can set very specific shutter speeds and apertures, and they don't go changing on me. Shutter speed doesn't matter so long as I'm on a tripod. So assuming you're on a tripod, you set whatever shutter speed is necessary. What's critical is your aperture. You typically are going to want more depth of field. Now that could be f11, that could be 16, 22, 32, it depends on a lot of factors we don't have time to get into, but we'll just say f16 for this case. The ISO is something you're definitely going to want at ISO 100 because that is the best quality possible. No exposure compensation, we're going to leave metering at evaluative, we're going to leave white balance at auto, change as necessary. With focusing, this is where we want to choose one shot. We want to be very particular about where we're focusing. You might also want to manually focus, but one shot and single point in the middle so that you can be very precise about what you're focusing on and you can lock that in. For the drive mode, there's actually a couple of options. You could use the single shot if you have a cable release. If you don't have the cable release, you could use the 2-second self-timer. And as a bonus, everyone likes bonus points, right? You could go into mirror lockup, shooting menu number 2, or you might have that as a shortcut under My Menu and lock the mirror up so that you don't have any vibration if you were to shoot at a slow shutter speed like 1 second. So that's landscape photography. Let's do portrait photography. All right, so in this case, big change, you're no longer on a tripod. You want to shoot a picture of a subject. You want them in focus, so focusing is critical. Shutter speed is important because they're probably moving around a little bit, whether or not they're relatively standing still. In these situations, I'd like to be in manual. I like to specifically choose a shutter speed, usually 125th of a second or faster. This is where having those faster lenses, if you have a 1.4 lens, you're probably really going to want to use it at 1.4. And so The faster the lens, often the better for portrait photography. You're definitely going to want to have this at the lowest ISO you can possibly get. Not going to worry about exposure compensation. We're going to leave metering at evaluative and white balance at auto. For focusing, we're going to go one shot. So we can focus on our subject, lock it, and then move it off to the side potentially so that we have a slightly different framing. And in order to do this, we're going to focus with the single point in the middle on their eye because we want to see their eye in focus. And the drive mode, I'd put it into continuous. People's facial expressions, their gestures, their smiles change, and you want to be ready for shooting a burst when it's the right time. Let's move on to action photography. So, you're shooting subjects that are moving towards you and away from you. And there's a lot of different types of action you can shoot with this camera. So this is where I would once again be in manual. You're going to need a faster shutter speed, probably 500th or faster. It depends on the action. This is where it really pays off to have a lens that goes down to 2.8. Sports photographers love lenses that go to 2.8 because that means they can get a faster shutter speed because the lens is letting in more light. Ideally, you would be at 100, but the reality is you're most likely going to need to bump that ISO up to 400 or so. I'm going to go ahead and leave the metering and white balance where they've been in previous sections because that hasn't changed. We are going to change the focusing, AI servo. We need the camera to constantly adjust focus for where our subject is so that we can shoot pictures at any point in time while they are moving around. And this is where I would go from single points to all points. It would be nice if this camera had more than 11 focusing points, but I'll take the 11. Overall, as a total group, they do a pretty good job. And for the drive mode, you can bet we're going to be in the continuous mode so that we can get lots and lots of pictures. Okay, let's do maximum sharpness. Now this is kind of related to the landscape mode, but if you were going to take a picture of, say, a painting on a wall, some wall art, some product photography, anything that's not moving around, I'm going to once again be in manual. Doesn't really matter the shutter speed if it's not moving and my camera's on a tripod, excuse me. An aperture in the middle of the range is where your camera is going to give you the sharpest pictures. It's not the most depth of field, but it's the sharpest setting, the middle of the aperture range. You'll definitely want to have your ISO as low as it can go. We're going to leave evaluative metering turned on and just good old auto white balance. We're going to switch back to one-shot focus so that our focus locks in wherever we want it to focus. And we're going to be very careful about where we point that single focusing point so that we can be very precise about what we focus on. We are a deliberate photographer. We are not an accidental photographer. And for the drive mode, going back to the single shot with the cable release, using the 2-second self-timer as an option, and possibly using mirror lockup. As the final one in this class, we will do just good old basic photography. This is where you don't know what your next picture is going to be. And so you're just walking down the street, you're got the camera, you're going to work, and you just want to be ready for whatever might happen. I would probably leave the camera with a little bit of automation turned on, and this is where I like aperture priority. I'll leave my camera in aperture priority, and I'm going to leave the aperture reasonably wide open. So maybe f4 would be a good compromise. I'm going to keep my camera in ISO 100, which is the best quality, and I will bump the ISO up as necessary. I'll be looking at shutter speeds, and if they're not a fast enough shutter speed, I'll bump the ISO up a little bit. Exposure compensation, I'm going to leave that set at 0, but I'll be ready to adjust it as necessary, a little brighter or a little darker. As you figured out, I'm a big fan of evaluative metering and auto white balance. I'm going to stick with those. For basic photography, I'm going to stay with one shot. This is where the camera focuses and stops so that I can recompose the photograph for better composition. And that single point is just so darn good in this camera, I'm definitely going to leave it on the single focusing point for most photography. And I'm just going to leave it in the single mode because I can pump my finger up and down on that shutter release pretty quickly if necessary, but normally I just want to take one picture at a time. And folks, if you have stuck it out all the way till now,